So I'll just say a few things about the paper, for those of you who haven't read it, the development that occurred after it, and then some responses, and then open up to the floor. I mean, the first observation I'd make about the paper is it's what I would call a pub paper. In a sense, it's not based upon any kind of original empirical research. It's based upon a series of meetings between me and Mike and Pub, and actually debating and discussing and thinking through and reflecting upon what we've been carrying out over a number of years in a number of different contexts. And it was a paper which we didn't know whether we would be broken up the topics because we wanted to say it's quite a controversial thing. But we went ahead, published it, and the response has been quite interesting, I think. It's quite interesting from my point of view because my background, having studied at the University of Surrey, is primarily that of a social statistician. I do a lot of survey research. But wherever I go now, people say, oh, I've changed sides. I'm no longer a quantitative researcher because you wrote that very critical paper about SurveyMapper, didn't you? I get a bit agitated about that because I don't really think that's the main point of the paper. What I want to try and do is summarise what I see as the main point of the paper. The main point of the paper is really to do with the nature of the jurisdiction that our subject now has over the study of the social. And our claim is that in the post-war years, the development of sociology was fundamentally tied up not with its theoretical contribution, although of course that was important, but over the kind of knowledge claims that it could make about the social, based upon a range of really quite, at the time, innovative research methods. Things that we now take as being obvious, things that we now take as being mundane, are very recent inventions. Sampling theory, survey methods, the qualitative interview, resident-based interviews. If you read Mike's book on the history of post-war British sociology, you'll see that the sociological enterprise is fundamentally tied up with innovations in those now very mundane methods. And the point we make in the paper is that if you take an orientation to discipline that is fundamentally empirical, if you think that the jurisdiction of our discipline is premised upon the knowledge claims that it can make about the social, premised upon those particular technologies, those particular methods of extracting data and analysing data, then in a sense we've lost some of that jurisdiction because those methods are now ubiquitous. They're seeped away. And don't just seeped away as well as disciplines, they're seeped away to commercial organisation, they're seeped away to journalism, they're seeped away to community websites, they're seeped away to a whole range of different organisations. So the main point of the paper really is to question the jurisdiction of the discipline. What is it about being a sociologist, if not the kind of claim that we can make upon our methodological expertise, that gives us any right to make any kind of privileged claims about the nature of social process? So that's the first question that we raise. There's another aspect of the paper as well, which we've developed subsequently, or I've developed subsequently with David here, which hasn't been perhaps as well kind of responded to or articulated. And that's to do with the nature of the, not the methods, but of the whole enterprise of sociological imagination. Because I want to make a secondary claim, which is that it's not just the methods of our discipline that have become successful and ubiquitous and are no longer defining the nature of our discipline. It's also this great claim that we make to the sociological imagination in C. Wright Mill's the insight that people make their discipline under circumstances of their own choosing. The insight that there's a very interesting relationship between biography and structural change, between public and private issues. And the claim is that the originality of that insight, the excitement that generated in the 50s, the 60s, and 70s through studies, through ethnography, through journals like magazines like New Society, like the ubiquity of things like the Penguin books, which became a kind of defining characteristic of the educated middle classes, the little Bruce Line books, studies of occupational cultures and such like. That sociological imagination is also something that, although we retain it within our discipline, is also something that's become more ubiquitous. Indeed, I would argue it's probably been something which is now becoming a defining characteristic of the best of popular culture. Some of you might have read a recent paper that same journal, Sociology, about an 80-year television series called The Wire. Anyone seen The Wire? We make the claim in that case, related to the coming crisis in empirical sociology, following a claim by William Wills, a seminar in Harvard in 2008, that in fact, The Wire is an outstanding piece of sociology. That it's an amazingly nuanced presentation written by journalists, written by sociologists, which gives genuine sociological insight. Genuine insight to life within Baltimore, within the police service, within the drugs community, within the education service. A sociological rendition that is far more nuanced than most sociological studies have been in recent years. So the claim is a double claim then. It's a claim that the methodological expertise that we invented, laid claim to, has been so successful it's now become generic. It's become increasingly something that's drawn upon by commercial rather than just by academic enterprises. And I don't just mean survey methods, I also mean face-to-face interview, qualitative analysis, and all of those sorts of things. But it's also the secondary claim that the nature of the sociological imagination, which we always begin our Sociology 101 courses advocating, is now something that's perhaps far more generic than we might imagine within Pupil television, perhaps even within computer games, within magazines, within good journalism, within novels. You know, none of these claims are original. C. Wilde says this in the sociological imagination. He says, when I talk of the sociological imagination, I don't mean discipline sociology necessarily. I certainly don't mean Lassenfeld or Parsons. I find the sociological imagination in fiction, in good journalism, and history. Or perhaps we find it in a far more ubiquitous way than what the cultural method idea too, which means that the stunning insights that perhaps many of us received in our youth when we came to study sociology are rather more mundane for our students, because if they watch good television, if they read good novels, if they read a good newspaper, would have come across these insights already, and perhaps won't quite understand the excitement we might feel about many of the studies that we point towards in culture, where run more documentary, insights into political cultures, the openness of private life is now something which is no longer just in the domain of sociology. So that's a theorizing account, but it's an account that's accessible and open and sometimes insightful. The third aspect of the paper is the one that most people have picked up on, I think, and that's the nature of the implications of digitization processes for what it means to do sociology. It's a claim that if sociology had made this claim to jurisdiction of studying social premise upon development of innovative methods, then we really, really needed to innovate radically and fundamentally again. Not to say that survey methods, standard multivariate statistical procedures don't still have a place, a very important place, especially within longitudinal studies and such like. Not to say that qualitative research methods is no use at all of these things still have value. But we now live in a world, we want to claim, where the ubiquity of digital transactional data and other forms of data as well means that we can no longer ignore the power of that kind of data. Now, it's the claim, and this might be counted in a moment, that that kind of data is generated by the state, but is also, and fundamentally, generated by commercial organizations. Terabytes and terabytes of data collected on individuals through credit cards, through clicks on an internet site, through credit reference agencies, through anything that involves digital transactions. Andrew Adler makes the claim, for instance, the thing that will define the future of sociology is our ability to rethink data analysis from the ground up, to actually deal with a world which is metricized, a world where we no longer have to ask people what they did when they did it, where website, they actually did spend as long as they said reading the financial section, or whether they actually spent rather a lot of time looking at Britney Spears or anything else they might be interested in that time. So it's a world where Facebook, Twitter, in the sphere of the internet, generates terabytes and terabytes of data that seem to have huge commercial importance. But what can we do with that data sociologically? It's also a world where increasingly we generate transactional data through the use of credit cards, use of our phone, through the use of any interaction that needs to be traced, and which of course is going to result in the current census being the last census. Because in the next 10 years there is the expectation that the ubiquity of this kind of transactional digital data, the production of this kind of administrative data will generate, if not real time, then certainly far more than decade-long traces of data which will allow us to monitor, survey, and increasingly mobile population. So it raises the question, where is sociology in all of this? Where are the innovations for the analysis of that kind of transaction data? Where are the skills in producing software and data aggregation techniques to model that kind of data based upon digital search? Where should we go to actually think about how we can actually reinvigorate the discipline to make it something that members of the public want to read in it? How can we actually make them want to buy the 21st century equivalent of Kenwood books? You know, what's going to be the digital equivalent of family kinship in East London? How can we actually try and really sharpen discipline to make it something that is a practice that people want to engage with, to understand, to be interested in? And our suggestion, and it's no more than that, is that perhaps we need to take far more seriously than we have done hitherto the role of description. The role of description as a social practice. Not to use description as, if you like, an insult. The paper was very descriptive, the grant application was rather descriptive, but actually to begin to think about ways of describing and redescribing the world which results from the availability of transactional data that's brought to that described. Because I think sometimes there's a headlong rush into analytics and into theorizations, but we don't even have an adequate description of what it is that we're trying to theorize. And if I've been touched or motivated by anything in recent years, it's been by geography and by commercial and journalistic enterprises to think about the way in which we can visualize data. Not just maps, although obviously maps as well, but the role of organizations like The Guardian, the role of even the Telegraph, I suppose, in terms of making data available, such that members of the public can begin to analyze it and re-visualize it, to think about the role of a whole range of essentially commercial or non-academic actors who have thought about new techniques for visualizing data. Websites like flowing data, for instance. Commercial organizations in the geodemographics industry, for instance, who work with geographers like Danny Dorling, or indeed who work at CASA, where you can visualize information in a way that makes you see the world differently. Where you can have a visualization of the credit crunch. YouTube is full of incredibly clever visualizations. Cartoons, presentations of statistical data, graphs. The Gapminder, for instance, the website that brings together data on health inequalities and animates it. Very little of this is happening within the academy. Very little of it, none of it is happening within ours. So what we conclude is that the coming crisis is that play on kind of Gilman. Sociology is always in crisis. The coming crisis of empirical sociology. In the end, has to be about something quite fundamental. Has to be about a fundamental reappraisal of what we do as a discipline, about what the content of our undergraduate programs are about what kind of skills we want to invoke within next generation of students coming through. For myself, and knew about sampling theory, could do not just basic statistical analysis, but quite sophisticated statistical analysis. I'd like them to be able to do qualitative interviews, be able to transcribe that data, to be able to analyze it using software, to be able to write up reports, to be able to produce maps, to be able to use GIS, to have a range of technical skills which allow them to describe the world. And I'd rather they spend less time reading the Guattari. Personally. No one's helpful as far as that. But if you look at the undergraduate curriculum, I would say that there's a need for a reprioritisation, perhaps. Not to say that theory is important, but to actually think about how we can reintegrate discipline through a reinvention of the methods that we employ within our practices. To re-establish the discipline as fundamentally not something which borrows every year the latest fad from France. Think through the philosophical implications of who is at the moment Badu. That's interesting stuff, but is it what discipline should be doing? Or is it about trying to think about how we can reintegrate social practice as a fundamentally empirical process to innovate and to claim again some kind of jurisdiction over the study of social, which will differentiate us from geography perhaps, differentiate us perhaps from very good journalism, and will allow us to stake a claim again. We've got something of real relevance and importance to say about the kinds of terrible social cognitive processes that we're witnessing at the moment. Your response, please.
Okay. Well, thanks, Roger, for a really good and thorough summary of the paper, which I revisited, but I will introduce myself. Yeah. Yes, indeed, yes. My name's Evelyn Rupert, and I'm a research fellow with the Center for Research on Social and Cultural Change, or CRESC, as some of you may know, which is a center between the Open University and Manchester. And when this paper came out, I had just joined CRESC, that was in 2007, and I was just starting to think of a project called The Last Census, which I'm just finishing now. At that time, I was finishing up some work which looked at censuses and historical perspective as ways of constituting populations. And I was starting to look at what many states have begun to do with government administrative data as an alternative to the census, and deemed often as being a better, if you will, register of population. So with this paper, that was really a springboard for me to start thinking about that administrative data in perhaps new ways. So I'm going to focus on how that article had an impact on the trajectory of that research, which was just starting at the time, and also subsequently through my conversations and meetings with both Roger and Mike, mostly through CRESC, where we've developed a lot of ideas and discussed some of these things. My general area of research is in population as a problem, and as not just something that's always and already out there, but something that states in particular expend a lot of resources to know as a means of governing, and how those techniques of governing are very important to understand in terms of the kinds of subjects and objects they produce. So while their original data mostly focused on commercial data, as Roger says, and on social data, I was interested in how the kinds of methodological questions that Roger has posed here about digital data in particular can also be taken up in relation to government methods and knowledge practices. In their follow-up response, which I can't remember what issue that was in, maybe a year or so later, they do talk a bit about some of these developments of administrative data and how it's being championed. And they also cite a couple of initiatives that have been underway in social science research that is also developing tools and ways of thinking about administrative data. And here I'm talking about the recently established ESRC-funded Administrative Data Liaison Service at the University of St. Andrews, which is a sort of gateway to different kinds of government administrative data that researchers can have access to in order to do research. As well, they also cite in this follow-up article the UK Data Forum, which brings together government agencies, funders, and the ONS to talk about the research infrastructure for the future, for the social sciences, and especially as an evidence base. And that includes discussions and analyses of the possibilities and potentials of administrative data. So all of these things have been happening at the same time and in parallel perhaps with their article. And we could say that we have both a social research agenda and a government agenda that's being invested in the possibilities of this administrative data. But I think for both researchers and governments, we can see some, I could call them promises of what administrative data can offer, as well as some of the technical shortfalls. I mean, in relation to the census, which only happens every 10 years and has problems of non-response and is expensive. Administrative data is seen as a way of perhaps solving those kinds of problems, if you will. While there are technical issues about that data, it's seen as still a better potential source of population knowledge. But the point that I want to take up, and which I think their article was an invitation to, was to examine the kinds of subjectivities and forms of expertise that are involved in the making of that data, and that this is, I would argue, fundamentally different from that, for example, of censuses. It's this byproduct aspect of administrative data, it's the kind of language that they also use in the article, that has a different relation to subjects and a different relation to expertise, and I want to highlight some of those differences, and I'll use the census as sort of a comparator, if you will, to sort of accentuate what I think some of these differences are. On the one hand, I would say it's a relation to what I call a doing subject, which they refer to as transactions, that what we have with administrative data is a record of encounters with governments that are logging changes in a person's lives, and how that is being routinely generated as a byproduct of those lives and activities. So not for the purposes of producing statistics or population statistics, but a part of a service culture. In that way, like commercial databases, we could say these are about relations and exchanges, or micro-relations and exchanges between individuals, government agencies, and that involve authorizations, services, licenses, treatments, training, and so on. So we have a very different register, I would say, than we have with a census. So instead of periodically asking people about who they are or what they do in relation to government, this is recorded through standard bureaucratic practices. And those are practices that depend on verifiability, and also that identification is secured in relation to authoritative categories of the state and the state's classification system, and not what people wish to report about themselves, but more how they become bureaucratic subjects. On the other hand, I think we can also think of this as involving a rearrangement of expertise then, where we have data collection being organized in relation to the needs and purposes and activities of distributed government departments as opposed to a central statistical authority, and involving many practitioners with various types of practices at work. One statistician called this as, instead of asking persons and households and businesses about themselves for information, the owners of administrative data become the source of population knowledge. And one example that you can read about more on the ADLS service is the National Pupil database. And this is a database that dates back to 2002, and it joins up student exam results with the student census or the pupil census. So you have information such as the postcode, gender, age, ethnicity, and those kinds of categories with performance. And it also contains information on schools. It's updated 3 times a year, and it's considered one of what could be possibly a set of joined up databases that could become a population statistical system. As an alternative to the census, and it currently contains about 8 million records a year. And many researchers have started to use this data to look at what kind of population knowledge and understanding can be attained from it. And there's a lot more I could say about that, but I'm just flagging it to raise one characteristic that I want to emphasize, is that that data is collected and it's entered, checked, and validated by administrators, educators, individual schools, and Department of Education bureaucrats. And it principally involved what we could call bureaucratic diagnostic or evaluation or assessment practices, kind of what I call performance metric, and involves also an administrative exchange of data between government departments to compile it. Now, I think this is an aspect of data that raises a number of methodological issues which are suggested in Mike and Roger's paper, and I'll briefly mention three that arise for me in my work. And one is that, in some ways, we could say this perhaps as a kind of return to practices that prevailed in the early part of the 20th century, which I think Mike delves into more in his book, where social research was routinely ingrained in the daily work of social workers, doctors, school inspectors, and the police. So we had a kind of observational economy in regards to administrative data, and the authority of that administratively derived data about whole populations was what was central and important. And at the same time, we can think about how observation, though, if we could call this an observational economy, an administrative data set, is also reconfiguring the governing practices and effects of population knowledge and expertise. We have different kinds of expertise involved, but we also are performing observation in a new and different kind of way that is perhaps more attuned to performance of a population, as opposed to a snapshot of it as an entity with a set of biographical characteristics. A second point I think that arises is that methods and other methods still persist. We still have a census in this country, and perhaps this will be the last one, but in those countries that have started to use administrative data either principally or partly as a source of population statistics, and particularly this applies to the Scandinavian countries, there is more of a hybridization, if you will, of methods, where in addition to population registers, surveys are still being used in different kinds of administrative databases. So I think we can also consider these kinds of techniques in government as becoming more of a hybrid, or what we say in the social sciences as mixed methods approaches. And I think this raises a bunch of questions that I'll close with in a moment. The third point is that while this data contains a lot of information what people do, and we talked about, or Roger talked about the transacting subject, and I have talked about that, transactions and exchanges. The category of the biographical and sociological categories that we often talk about persist. That issues or questions such as gender, ethnicity, for example, continue, and we can think perhaps of how they are maybe being remade through administrative practices. So while they still are there and they persist and they continue, which I think is something we need to think about and make problematic, that continuity and persistence, they're also, I think, being remade in new ways or reconfigured, perhaps in relation to matters or data on performance. So I think these kinds of questions of subjectivities and also of knowledge and expertise and persistence and continuity of older techniques and particular kinds of categories are the kinds of questions that arise for me out of their paper. And I think these are the kinds of methodological questions that we need to ask whether we use that administrative data, which is being promoted as a potential source of research in the future, or if we are studying it in ways that it's taken up in government. And for that, we could say the same, of course, about the commercial and social data that Roger mentioned. Since the publication of their paper, we know there have been lots of developments in digital methods, and a lot of them are proliferating out there, perhaps not so much in the academy, but are active methods in the world. And I think we need to open those up to some critical analysis. In short, I think these are just some of the issues that I thought I would highlight to illustrate how the kinds of ideas that they raise in the paper could be taken up in relation to government data. And I think while, yes, we can question whether there is a crisis, and crisis talk itself can be something you can be critical about, I think it was more of an invitation and a provocation to sort of think or rethink our repertoires in standard ways that we, especially who use data, work with that data and the kinds of differences that get enacted through the different kinds of data and methods that we use. So I think I'll maybe just end it there. We can take that up in the conversation afterwards.
I'm intrigued. I'm intrigued, why I'm here, Robert. But also intrigued because I run a research lab, CASA, and we do geography, we do architecture, we do planning. And there are times when you're out with friends and you're having a glass of wine and you say, I do geography, I do planning, I do architecture, and you suddenly realise that your work's actually a bit dull. And people don't really get what you do. And I read this paper through, and I love the fact that it was a pub paper. All the best papers are pub papers. It's not your classic academic paper. It's paper that actually says something. And the crisis is there. I see the crisis across geography, architecture, planning, the whole range. And I've been running the lab for 6 months, but I've had a say for the last 3 or 4 years. And we took a radical step. We brought computer science into the same place. So we're doing all this theory paper, but the world's changed. It's a Web 2.0 world, a horribly overused phrase, moving towards a Web 3 world. And the world has changed. And it's not what your traditional academic subjects do nowadays, because it's not what commercial firms do. Commercial firms are caught on the hop too. The census has gone. We've just had the last one. That's it. There'll be no more census. I think that's fantastic. I think the census was terrible. I've sat through so many conferences and talks where people talk about this census data and geodemographics. It's all fab, but it's old. We're moving towards a real-time world where I can tell you, if I had your Twitter name, who here tweets? 3, 4. Who's on Facebook? Okay, more on Facebook. Who's on LinkedIn? And I'll end on that point. Okay, so a few. Yeah, who's not on any, what classified as Web 2.0 world? No one, great. But we do Twitter mapping, okay? So within a weekend, I can run this little software tool which our computer scientists have written for me, because I don't know how, but I know what I want to grab. And he can collect, hundreds of thousands of tweets over the weekend, and whatever you say on the phone, we can grab, and we can grab your location too. So we have a London map of a London weekend of tweets, and it zooms into someone's house, and a tweet comes up above the house that says, I love you, kiss, kiss, kiss. And then, I'm not sure I should be looking at this. But then you think, well, is that to his wife? Or is it to someone outside? If someone else retweets, you can geographically jump to that too. And then I gave a talk at Oxford 2 weeks back. To be honest, most of my talks go down quite well. This was the first one in many years which didn't go down well, on the question of ethics. And this paper is almost sort of raising those points. The world has changed. I haven't signed an ethic form. I haven't, to be quite frank, I'm a geographer, I'm a planner. I haven't even thought about it. We're doing the Internet of Things work, and we're talking about putting QR codes, which are these little black and white things on my cards, onto children as temporary tattoos. Because you can tell stories of things. It's a narrative thing. But from an ethic point of view, that must be a nightmare. But there's no, I'm just not going to go through the university system to sign the ethic form. Because the research has moved on so quickly that we do our research in 6 weeks now, and then we move on. If it's worked, fab, we'll put a paper out there, it all goes on YouTube, it's all publicly rated. We have to do the normal academic work, of course, but that takes 6 months, 8 months. We put it online. We crowdsource our entire academic department now. And the research techniques have seeped away. We've just released something called SurveyMapper. It's called surveymapper.com. We released it because we thought it would be good to allow anyone in the world to ask anyone else in the world whatever they wanted and have it mapped in real time. It's being used by the London Mayor, it's being used by media firms. But the fact that we've put a questionnaire system online without knowing anything, and I'm aware I'm being filmed here, but I was reading through the paper and I was filled with complete horror that 1962, the first proper survey system came on. I didn't know that. We just put a survey tool online for anyone in the world to use. So we've almost thrown away the science, put the tools out there, collecting the data, and then bringing the science back in. Don't know whether that makes me look good or bad, but I'd say the crisis is in the world has changed. We need to catch up. We need to be grabbing the Facebooks and tweets and the real world out there, because that's where the people are. That's where we can grab things. And every lab or every department should have at least 3 computer scientists. And I think that's where I'll probably leave it, because you can bounce back on those points. Thank you very much.
Okay. That was all we were going to say. I mean, I can respond, but maybe it would be better just to open it up to the floor, because I think we've tried to be provocative, and it would be interesting to hear people's reactions to those issues. I'll just ask one other question before we end our presentation. One of the things that came out of this in a kind of an odd way was doing work with the BBC. Who has not filled in the great BBC class survey? Has not? Shame on you. The largest social survey ever carried out in Britain. 165,000 cases now. Bourdieusian class analysis, the first time that Bourdieu has been seen on the One Show. Sociologically impactful. Web 2.0 application, you fill in the form and it feeds back in a semi-serious way, cultural, economic and social capital, a very interesting data collection tool, which for instance will allow us to look at the various returns to investment of studying any subject in the country in any university in the subject in the country. So sociologically significant, I hope. So if you haven't done so, go to the BBC British class survey online as a kind of an example, as an illustration of what it might be possible to do in terms of thinking about how we can innovate methodologically. But perhaps the best thing to do now is just open up to the floor to get comments, questions, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. It's very exciting. But I think where I don't really agree is the second point about the sociological imagination. I mean, I agree to the fact that the bio, for instance, is great social science. But I think that's always been the case. There's a lot of literature and films that is much better actually sociology than sociology. But I think that's where sociology comes in. It's through the sociological imagination, through our concepts, through our theories. I think that's where we can actually contribute to something. So that's why I'm not so sure about, describing more. Yeah, obviously we should describe. But I think the important thing where we can actually contribute is that interpreting it through our concepts. And I think that's why, I don't know if it's because I'm coming from a boring social science department in Stockholm, but because I've seen at least from my perspective, from theory to just, I would say Glaserfeldian empirical research, but so I think actually we need to sort of stimulate our sociological imagination, and we can do that through reading, for instance, the Observational. I'm not saying we should just, get in there. And I think sociology, it should not always be easy. It's not always easy to write, because that can also sort of lead to a dumbing down. I mean, I'm all for clarity, and all really. But I think if we really take that idea of the pulp paper, but everything should be really easy to understand. I think some things are very complex, and sometimes we need to, challenge it. Sometimes it's difficult, and I think that's, I'm not all for, reading, French, thinkers, and yeah, I think we're really irritated by this. But still, I think we should always just strive for the complete.
Clearly I was being provocative in only half series because I've had a bash at 1,000 Plateau, but I suppose it's to try and make the case for a fundamental recalibration of the division of labour in the academy. So for my sins, I recently wrote a history of something called SPSS. Anyone come across SPSS? Okay. Well, it's my observation, and it's an ethnographic observation, I suppose, over a number of years, is that people who spend a lot of time using SPSS tend not to do conversation analysis, tend not to read Deleuze and Guattari. I think that's wrong. I think that our discipline, and the social sciences more generally, should be far more pluralistic and should not develop a priori methodological commitments. They should choose appropriate methodological and theoretical tools to address the question at hand. And I think for too long there's been a sort of a fetishization of both method and of theory. So you say to someone, what are you working on? And they say, oh, Deleuze. God help us. Or they're saying, oh, I'm working on, structural equation modeling. Well, no. For me, anyway, that's part of the crisis. They should be working on interesting, complex, substantive issues which might bring to bear, or need to bring to bear, a range of theoretical and conceptual and historical and methodological tools to deal with that issue. So I suppose what I'm asking for is a kind of a... And I think this goes right the way back to fundamentals, right the way back to Sociology 101 about a reinvention of the discipline, to actually think far more seriously about the range of theoretical and conceptual and methodological skills that we need to bring to bear. Because my worry is that actually a lot of our students gravitate towards the discipline by default because they don't like stats, and it's an area where they don't need to do stats. There's undergraduate degree programs in this country where you have to do a chi-square test and that's it. No, this is wrong. This is crazy. How can we allow our students to make themselves ignorant when the world is being structured by metrics? How can we want ourselves to be ignorant, not to understand the algorithmic power that is generative of so much of social life? Our job as social scientists, given the role of code and software within so many aspects of social power relations, we need to understand how the code is written. We need to understand the occupational cultures of computer scientists. We need to make ourselves understand multivariate statistical models, not because we agree with them philosophically or we're necessarily going to use them, but the tools of research methods are now an object of inquiry as well as a set of methodological tools. They are generative of the world. And I think sometimes we haven't realized that we've thought that the tools that we use to describe the world analytically are just that. They're not. They are generative of the world. And they make money. If you look at the geodemographics industry, if you look at the power of cluster analysis, if you look at the power of data mining technologies, if you look at many of the tools that originated within the social sciences, they are the very tools which corporate capital are now utilizing in terms of the new predictive economy, it seems to me. So, if nothing else, the politics of method is actually turning our kind of conceptual and methodological lens in on ourselves to look at the actual generative power of those practices as well. So I'm only half being, I think we should encourage a far more pluralistic set of expectations in our students.
Just everything you were just saying is what I'm studying at the moment. I'm a PhD student, and I'm looking at food consumption and health and class, and geodemographics has that completely mapped out. And I think, I think your article was saying, among other problems, can we even get a hold of this kind of data? Can we get these big data houses to share it or open it up? they're doing that with business faculties and marketing departments, but are they going to do it with people who want to critique what they're doing? And the thing, there was a really great critique of demographics from geographers, and they've been saying that it's not just a matter of sort of tracking who lives where, and increasingly where they are during the day as well. It's not just where you live, it's all the technology you carry and use, and you can be tracked everywhere you go, and then marketed to, on the spot. But when people say, well, maybe this isn't entirely accurate. If you look at this, there was 61 consumer profiles from Mosaic or Experience. Are they accurate? Some people say, well, maybe it doesn't matter if they're accurate. The very fact that they exist, and corporations use them to make, for example, food citing decisions. This is where you cite your fast food joints. It makes them accurate, but over the long term, if you have this idea and you structure the foodscape in a certain way, it does eventually, serve those people it was aiming at in the first place. And there's a tremendous division of class and food consumption, and not just, in terms of organic or junk food, but even within, crisps. We all got a free packet of crisps in our lunch here, and these are, no glass crisps, no doubt. But pizza is classed. All of these things are classed, and there's a health implication there. And the sociology of food doesn't look at this. It's fascinated by ethnic food and all kinds of sort of cultural issues, without looking at the amazing role of transnational corporations everywhere, from agriculture to art. Really, it's all there. So
you're preaching to the convert. I mean, we did a paper on geodemographics, software and class, which was making that point. I mean, getting het up about the accuracy or otherwise of what's essentially a data sculpture is the way I would think of it. Misses the point. It's about the co-construction of the world through those systems. Well, I think that's the challenge. It's a reconfiguration of who now maps the world. I mean, I think in a sense the point that Evelyn was making is in a sense we're seeing, the state is no longer being primarily constitutive of the subject. I mean, if I were being really, really depressed, so let's be really, really depressed, I would say that Experian is the new ONS. They are. They are. Now, how frightening is that? Yeah. But it's more constitutive than that as well, because even the government surveys, in terms of the stratified random nature of their samples, are premised upon ACORN categories. So it's built into those algorithmic systems from the beginning. The world is defined through that conceptual lens. Now, one of the things I think is quite interesting with some of your colleagues, ex-colleagues, Richard Webber and the people involved in these processes, is that they themselves have been quite open. They've come to our workshops and are engaged. They've read Bourdieu. I mean, when we made Richard read Bourdieu, he said, oh, well, that's what I've been doing. I hadn't realized it was called habitus. But that's exactly what I've been trying to map. Fantastic. And so, you play little games with Richard. You give him 4 or 5 things in your shopping basket, and he tells you what category, where you live, essentially. So there is a kind of an interesting vernacular commercial sociology there that is incredibly nuanced, but which, it's quite interesting, the reaction to that paper. It's not social class. It's too complicated. There's 67 categories. And actually we need to go back to an aggregate approach, well, maybe not, in a sense, the predictive power of that quite nuanced technology. I'm not worried what it's called, but the underlying statistical clusters are powerful, and it's global. I mean, Mosaic is in urban China, Japan, anywhere where those kinds of transactions occur. So it's difficult to compete. It's difficult to compete. But it does involve a reconfiguration of our relations, not just with the state, but with commercial agencies in terms of actually gaining access to that data. Because
isn't the point that, yes, these big partly hold
about theory method division. I'm glad that one came up because in the example you gave of Bourdieu and experience, we can see that methods already have within them theories. They have concepts, whether they're explicit or not is some point you can make and you can argue. But I think the challenge is to look at what kinds of theorizations and conceptual understandings of the subject of the world out there are embedded and part of those methods, so that we don't have a divide, I think, either in, the practices of the private sector or of government, is that often there's seen, theories over here and we do our methods, but I think theory is in method. And one of the challenges is to think about that and come to understand how those concepts are at work, and not a separate thing. So yes, we need lots of more theory, I think, about that and thinking about it than less when we talk about methods.
I mean, practically one of the things we've attempted to do, we hope it gets through the refereeing process, but Evelyn, John Law, Mike Savage and other colleagues have been involved in producing a special issue of the journal Theory, Culture and Society about these issues, which wouldn't be the traditional outlet that you'd go for a collection of papers about these methodological practices. But we think it's important actually to offer it to social and cultural theory and to think about how we can actually not make it a dry methodological debate. We're going to get nowhere if we just stay within the domain of ESRC research methods nodes or something. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the political, the cultural, theoretical implications of these changes and processes. I was going to say Paul, but Sarah, whichever. Okay.
All right, I think this is really, really interesting and really important. But I don't really agree with what you say about we need to know who writes the code, we need to understand. I mean, I don't disagree with that. I think people are beginning to write interesting things about code. But you can't know what the algorithms are. And having 3 computer scientists in your department is going to tell you that. So I'm curious to know how you think the training that we offer our PhD students in particular should basic practical things. What are we expecting them to do? Are we expecting them to be able to know PHP to build a website? Are we expecting them to know what are we seriously and practically talking about in terms of changing the way that people do sociology? That's what I want to hear.
Well, I think there's a number of reactions to that. One is I think we need to think about the organisation, and it comes back to a debate and Kerr's panel yesterday about the nature of interdisciplinarity and about how we work together, because we can still have a division of labour. We can still work with computer scientists, but we have to learn how to work with computer scientists. We have to develop a set of cultural practices which are different to the ones that pertain at the moment. We have to think about the hierarchy and the relations of disciplines and how we actually work together, because we do need to radically reconfigure the kind of the skill set that we bring, and that doesn't be embodied within one person. It needs to be embodied within groups where you build up trust relations. The only way you do that is to actually get people to work together, to become friends, to get to know each other, to understand each other's kinds of norms and values in relation to those issues. But the other thing is, and I think it's happening already, is actually, let's get the computer scientists in and make them social scientists. If we can't train ourselves up, or we don't want to train ourselves up in that regard, let's work with people who are political. Let's work with people who are socially and culturally minded, who are interested in these issues. Let's develop new hybridic forms of education such that those skill sets actually do pertain, and we can work around those sorts of issues. So I think it's a big challenge, and it actually might involve new curricula. It might involve new expectations about what you do in an undergraduate degree program. Why not do a degree which involves doing sociology, cultural theory, and computer science? I mean, these things exist, but why aren't these becoming more mainstream? Why can't the academy think about reconfiguring itself in terms of the world as we think it's developing? So I think the challenge is within disciplines, but also in terms of the rearrangements within our academic institutions. How we begin to talk to each other is the challenge of interdisciplinarity, but what passes for interdisciplinarity at the moment isn't a few anthropologists and cultural theorists and sociologists working together. It's about a radical reconfiguration of people with very, very different ontological and epistemological assumptions coming together, I think.
Yeah, it's been really fascinating. I'm going to take things a little bit slightly differently, and I think this interdisciplinarity is terribly important. And one of the things which I think about kind of data and new data is that increasingly not just collecting survey data, I think in things like the Understanding Society, new reincarnation of the HPS, where you've got very, very good examples, you've got contact response rates, and I think this is a key driver to other things, administrative. So what do we do when you get 50% or less response rate? Does response rate matter? I mean, we always used to think it did matter, but maybe it doesn't. But the point here is they're now going to be collecting all sorts of biological data, so genes data, cholesterol data, bloods, blah, 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 and there'll be fantastic power, if you like, of relating very complex, all the sociological data which we're very used to this health data and what it means. And beyond that also, you've got it within families. And I think one of the other issues is that individualisation, and I think what you've been talking about has been about thinking of people as individuals, you can follow individuals around. And I think as sociologists, we have to see people as parts of networks, and particularly parts of families and parts of couples and parts of life. And I think one of the power again of some of the things like family and household surveys, you can actually, you've got all that. And I think, to be honest, that researchers haven't exploited that. We've had the HPS for years, we've done a lot on longitudinal stuff and in history, but we still don't really understand some of the dynamics within families and how different things interact with each other. So I think that's kind of another area we need to kind of move on. And while I've got the floor, I'd like to say something somewhat different. This issue about sociological imagination and methods is very important. And as you know, I do work on sleep. A few other people know that. And sociologists have entirely neglected sleep and the night. And when we started doing this work, we did it because we were involved with a lot of physiologists who were interested in menopause and women's sleep. So they said, oh, would you like to come on board? You know, what's the EG grant and all that. I said, great. And we thought, well, you know, where's the sociology of sleep doesn't exist? How do we actually find out about women's sleep? And how do it? Yes, you can do focus groups, you can do interviews, which we did. But then we had to develop new methods. So we developed our audio sleep diaries. We use the physiology measures as well, the actigraphy and so on. But actually we understand more from that because we merge some of the sociological methods with the physiological methods, and that actually gives us new insights. And the physiological sleep scientists are now kind of waking up and thinking, my God, you know, that's actually terribly important, social process of sleep and couple dynamics of sleep, and we can actually understand that by looking at the traces of actigraphy, and the husband and the wife, and the audio sleep diaries of each, and the in-depth interviews, and a couple of these in part 7. So they, you know, there are still places, I hope, spaces, and there will be, where people will say that's a really interesting, important issue. We need to study it as sociologists, but actually maybe we need to amend, develop new tools, methods to do it, and that then gives kind of new insights and so on.
Just a quick jump in. I think the important thing is to always be aware of what is going on beyond your own line of work. This may sound a bit odd. I only used it once as a test. There's an iPhone sleep app which I laid by my bed, and it tracked my night's sleep, and it filled me with complete horror. The rough night's sleep, and there's peaks, and it records the sound, and then it can upload to a server, so you can crowdsource thousands and thousands of people. And I'm sure if you could get hold of that sort of data set, it's a very powerful toolkit.
But again, as a sociologist, class, you know, generation, age, you know, who are the people who have apps? I mean, we still need to look at the other social characteristics. I mean, what we're showing is huge social inequalities in sleep. Given sleep is important for health and well-being, actually there are things which we haven't really looked at and so on. So, yeah, I think that's great. We can do things with the apps and things, but we always need to think about who the people who have the apps and to what extent actually maybe they're very differently typical.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to the point before about how do you teach and how do you get it into the curriculum in the academy, and to reflect on our experiences with the labour movement, embedding emerging disciplines call, which I don't know if you remember, it was a few years back, and it was a cross-subject area, it was about new disciplines. And we got quite far in that with the bit around social mathematics to the last 5
We got through to the interview stage, Anne, if I remember.
And what happened with that was we had pitched that and thought about that in relation to all of these developments around research need, but also a pedagogic need and a teaching need. So a lot of the bit was about what we would do in terms of curriculum development, new courses, new degrees. And we found at the point of the interviews, of what actually ultimately got funded was a research agenda, not a teaching agenda, which will inevitably trump, a research agenda will inevitably trump, and I think that was precisely the wrong way to go about establishing an emerging discipline. And also that we had some very eminent sociologists on the panel who detested, clearly, the proposal, because it took sociology to task on a number of fronts, and it was completely unpalatable for that reason. So how you get into these new territories obviously involves conflict and dispute, but there's so many barriers that it seems obviously incremental change is going to have to be the way one proceeds.
I was there. I agree.
Yeah.
I think it's a very different set of practices. But I do think it is a research agenda. But I do think it's about changing the undergraduate experience of what it means to do a sociology degree in terms of the skill set that's required.
Is the process of industrialization of knowledge production really unique? What we have observed here with regard to sociology has happened earlier with a lot of other natural sciences, pharmaceutical industry, there's a lot of fancy stuff. However, it has survived at universities. Engineering, chip industry, similarly, there are fancy things going on in chip factories. However, there is still electronic engineering at the engineering departments. So what can we learn from the division of labor of other sciences, which were much earlier with regard to the competition and the knowledge production by industrial companies? Are there parallels? And what does it mean for sociology? It was never oriented towards a profit-oriented knowledge production. It was always critical with regard to his vested interests. It is perhaps a contrasting perspective. If you're looking at the pharmaceutical industry, it was not really a topic, but in sociology we try to be the topic. The power players with a lot of money, vested interests, was part of the predictions.
I think it's a very good question. I'm not sure of my response, other than to say I'm quite taken by some of Andrew Abbott's analysis of the nature of disciplines, academic disciplines. I mean, it's a complex analysis, the chaos of disciplines, I think the book is called. But he does make the point that disciplines exist within the academy, even though they're talking to a world that no longer exists. And I think there's a bit of that going on in relation to some of the social sciences. That in a sense, we comfort ourselves to think that we're often doing work that has a contemporary relevance and talks to our students' interests. But actually, sometimes perhaps, and this is, I'll say it, it's a controversial thing to say, I know, we're in danger of becoming a zombie discipline. The Walking Dead, if we're not very, very careful. The kinds of examples, the kind of illustrations, the kinds of traditions, the kinds of studies that we point towards to our students, to our 18, 19, 20-year-old students, are of very great contemporary historical interest, but they don't really talk to the world that many of them occupy. So I think this is an issue with the social sciences in generally, the speed up of social change. Even to describe what's happening is a challenge, let alone to think about it analytically. So I suppose I think that although much of our kind of methodological and perhaps conceptual practices have seeped into other disciplines, into other practices, into commercial sectors, into marketing and such like, it comes back to the thing like the international benchmarking, the report on the RAE. We're an exported discipline. And I think the danger is that we've exported so much, it's not very clear what there is left within the academy that we want to defend. But I think we at least need to be kind of honest about that and think about how we can begin to defend and articulate the discipline. I went to the head of departments meeting yesterday. There's a couple of people there. You found it profoundly depressing, I must say, the whole notion of we need to defend the discipline and be proud of the discipline in a way that the scientists are. Not a kind of an arrogant self-belief that we are right and we've got, we actually need to be sure that we actually are engaged in a set of interesting, contemporary, relevant practices, and the discipline within the academy is dynamic. It's no good senior members of the BSA or of whoever moaning and groaning about it and depressing younger colleagues. We need to enthuse them, we need to encourage them, we need to think about new, innovative practices, and we need a fundamental reinvention of the discipline, I think.
I think, well, I do agree with you on many points, and I agree about the data, but you said about sort of technical skills and teaching skills and sort of parting with the theories and that thing. It got me thinking about the following thing. I'm a sociologist at work, who now works in business school, where lots of quiz migrated recently, and I remember when I was crossing over to the dark side, somebody said, sort of slightly condescendingly, and the condescending attitudes were coming from the fact that business schools are too practically oriented and too kind of instrumental, too technical, and so what we teach is just skills. And in fact, this is quite a few places around, we pride ourselves on actually teaching theory and analytical theory. And we do teach accounting, mature, and diverse, and class analysis and all sorts. So I think if I were to be worried, I'm kind of not that worried about sort of jurisdiction, but I'm worried about the jurisdiction in terms of sort of analytical tools. And not yes, data, but how we analyze it, what we apply to data analysis, and sort of letting that go.
Right, I think business schools, the York Management School is similar, in a sense that it's a multidisciplinary space full of philosophers, sociologists, radical accountants. So it's an interesting intellectual space, and in some ways I think geography departments, or some geography departments and some business schools have the character that sociology departments had in the late 70s and 1980s. I mean, John Arry wrote a very famous paper about the sociologist's parasite, which was a great and influential paper because it was actually about why it was such an exciting place to be. It was a broad, porous intellectual space where you could borrow things from different disciplines, bring them together in a relatively safe environment, and have a good argument about them and see what was useful or not. I think in recent years, the direction of travel has been in the other direction, and we've been an exporter discipline to criminology, social policy, business schools, medical schools. Sociology is now and research methods. Look in the bookshops. Research methods for business, research methods for nursing, research methods, that we're in danger of actually becoming the residue, the miscellanea, because our practices are now ubiquitous across the social sciences and many professional subjects as well. Now, that might be fine. That's a success story, actually, in one way. There's more people who read, and know about sociological methods and know about sociology. The issue is actually a institutional and political one. Do we want to reclaim the discipline in some way, shape, or form to make it distinctive? If we're going to do that, we need to innovate methodologically. We need to rethink our empirical agenda, I would argue. If we don't want to do that, that's fine. We can engage in work in a range of different multidisciplinary settings. But, it's worth at least asking the question rather than just walking in zombie-like manner when there's no bookshops left with sociology sections because they're all under cultural studies or wherever they're actually being placed at the moment. Is it possible to reassert for £9,000 a year the distinctiveness of the discipline in a way that is exciting, insightful, useful? Can we produce something like New Society again? Can we produce something that's the equivalent of those Penguin classics? can we produce a set of practices that don't just produce papers and books? You know, maybe we should be designing websites, maybe we should be making documentaries, maybe we should be making dramas. Why are we not thinking more broadly about what we can do in terms of a range of sociological practices that touch to people's use of media, for instance?
Hi, I came from the ethics session before lunch, so you mentioned ethics and some suggestion that if I kind of caught what you said, accurately enough, some suggestion that the world is changing, and so I don't think, it seemed to me implying that maybe we didn't need ethics anymore. But given that geography is still implicated with the SOC, because we're looking at research excellence, I'm kind of puzzled by the notion that geography or some of the work or the kinds of digital transactional data that you're talking about are somehow outside of ethics. And partly I'm wondering, well, if you'd say some more clarified, because I'm suspecting I may be possibly wrong, but maybe not. But I'm wondering also, is the issue more that actually we haven't yet figured out ways of thinking ethically about this, the kind of work that we do, and Evelyn, Roger would like to kind of comment on ethics in any way in relation to what the work that you're thinking about.
Well, yes, I think your last point is exactly the point. We do things very quick in, quick out, because the world is rapidly moving on from a technology point of view, and we can capture it. I think it's only after we've captured it that we sit back and think, oh, perhaps we shouldn't have done this. We did a tool called the Tweeter Meter. It's a very twee name. The science behind it is actually quite good. And it was used on global news 2 weeks ago, just after the earthquake hit. And they had the UCL Tweeter Meter. And I felt extremely uncomfortable to see it up there. And that's a slight ethical thing too. I don't want my research being used for CNN News in almost a comical way. Tweets around the world peaked when the wave hit. But it is the point where we almost look at the ethics afterwards, because we're capturing everything online, and the services we've used, you've already clicked yes to the terms. So we're using their terms that you've clicked yes to, rather than our own in-house terms.
I come at this from a different, maybe slower angle, and slowing things down. We can think in terms of government data as upfront being concerned with confidentiality, privacy, and ethics. But even after one could secure all of those things, I think there are bigger epistemological ethical considerations. What's called statistical purposes has an ethical dimension. If we believe or agree that methods are generative and both constitutive of the real and the represented simultaneously, then the way we come to know ourselves and the worlds that we come to make up through our methods have consequences. And I think that's a bigger political ethical question. You can have all the safeguards and consent forms and anonymity that can be built in to statistical systems, and governments go through hoops to ensure that. Even after that's secured, I think there's a bigger dimension that has to come into our methodological discussions as well, which often get, I think, forgotten because we get into the individual privacy question, which is not unimportant, but not alone, I think.
I'd probably better not comment on my position on ethics. I think the discipline, I think the social sciences are so timid about ethical issues that I despair. None of the classic sociological studies could be carried out today. If I wasn't a sociologist and I was a journalist, I could do all sorts of crap. Write about it, put people's names on the screen, show where they live, put a false camera on myself. Now, we might not like that, we might be appalled by that, but what do we do professionally? We don't engage in really important studies. Where are all the good observational studies now? We don't do observational studies. We're worried about informed consent. We wouldn't get ethical approval by a bunch of people who, I shouldn't talk about it, but the discipline to me is been undermined fundamentally by a technology of an overstated set of ethical considerations which were appropriate to various forms of medical research but really don't pertain to many of the practices that we engage in. Just a simple example. We did an ESRC-funded study about what it's like to be a doctor, and we wanted to interview 30 GPs and consultants. It took us about 3 months to get ethical approval to interview some doctors. This is crazy. This is absolutely crazy. And so we've generated, or we have had generated for us, a culture where we are timid about engaging in a range of methodological practices that might actually generate insight. I mean, one other thing I would say, I think we need a fundamental reinvigoration of good quality, long-term observational studies in the discipline. But that's a different issue. But and I know on the margins in terms of those views. Okay. Any final?
I'm interested in your mixture, because there's an ambivalence that sort of it's throughout this, one of excitement about the future and possibilities of collaboration and sociology. On the other hand, it's a bit defensive. Oh my gosh, this is in crisis. And I'm wondering how important that empirical was in this matter of that paper, because in some ways the narrative of disability crisis is one that's constantly goes on in a world where disciplinary formations come to fruition and then disappear. So you're worried about sociology, but does it matter? I mean, isn't that identity politics? Doesn't it matter what our label is? What we do is a combination of the training we've got and the intellectual traditions we provide or turn to the methodological paths. Why do the labels so important?
Well, I think the way you framed the question was correct. I mean, I think the empirical is key, because I think it's premised upon a view of the development of the discipline that not everyone would agree with, which is that the distinctiveness of the discipline has been based upon its methodological practices and not upon its theoretical contributions, which, although important, have tended to vary and to come and go with time. Whereas the methodological innovations that we've been involved in have been relatively enduring and continue to be enduring, and for me and for Mike, I know, have come to define the nature of the discipline, and they're of a recent invention. So I suppose our argument would be about the coming crisis of empirical sociology, not necessarily sociology in the round, but of the empirical tradition within sociology, and the necessity to think about innovation in relation to methodological practices, in relation to the way in which the world has changed and data availability. And the concern that those innovations, where they are occurring outside of the academy. They're occurring within the commercial sector, within the defence industry, within the security industry. And to think through about how we can reinvent our relations with those sometimes brilliant innovations, actually, in terms of how data is presented, how data is visualized. And we haven't really spoken about the visualization turn, because that was our conclusion, that we wanted to think about how sociology could become a more visual subject and think about the use of graphs, patterns, maps, and shapes in those ways. So, might be wrong, but I do get a distinct sense in this country, in Australia, New Zealand, the countries I'm more familiar with, of a certain lack of confidence in the discipline, especially among senior colleagues. I suppose it's just to say, well, what's the basis of that? And is there anything that we could begin to do, people we could work with, practices that we could begin to look at that could lead to innovation and a re-enchantment and a greater sense of belief in the power of sociology? So it's a sense of loss, really, because for so many of us, I think, it was a transformative discipline. I did economics, for Christ's sake, economics, sociology and statistics. I did sociology at Surrey just to do something different, because I'd done economics and statistics before, and it was transformative. Actually, it talked to one's biography, it talked to a better understanding in the world. And I think people in the discipline often want to re-invoke that sense of freshness and insight that the discipline provided them into the new generations of students coming through. And I think we very often fail to do that now. And I'd like to find a way of actually re-establishing that excitement in the 18 and 19-year-olds who come through the undergraduate program. Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming along.